many of your progressive allies, like Premier Wab Kinew, like the leader of the Alberta NDP, Rachel Notley, like Liberal Bonnie Crombie, like Liberal Andrew Furey, all of them are saying the same thing as Pierre Poilievre in this instance.
Fighting climate change is hard.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. Vassy Kapelos interviewed environment fanatic Stephen Guilbeault on the impact of canceling the April 1st carbon tax increase. As she has become known for, she was not accepting of his flawed arguments and boogeyman scare tactics.
Let's take a look.
Minister, good to see you. Thank you very much for making the time.
My pleasure, Vassy.
Can you explain to Canadians watching, Minister, why it was okay to pause the price on carbon for home heating oil, but not for this upcoming increase as of April 1st?
So the very reason for putting a price on pollution, and it's been done before, and not just for climate change, but for other environmental challenges, is that you want to incentivize change in behavior for companies, industrial organizations, but also individuals. What we found out with home heating oil is that the vast majority, in fact, of people who are still using home heating oil in Canada, and there are more people in my home province of Quebec than in all of Atlantic Canada, for example, that still use it, but tend to be lower to middle income Canadians who don't have the money to make the switch for less polluting form of home heating oil, home heating, which is why we decided to put a pause specifically on this, because home heating oil is the most expensive, it's the most inefficient, and it's the most polluting way of heating your home.
I'm sure I could think of worse ways.
I'm sure I could as well. But, they're looks like they're trying to tax people, with fireplaces as well. But anyway, let's just reflect on that. So he's trying to say that the people that are most common in having home heating oil as a fuel source are low-income Canadians. Okay, let's just accept that premise. The other argument that they make for the carbon tax rebate is that it benefits people at the low income margin the most.
And that you get more back than you're paying into it. So why would you stop the carbon tax and presumably the rebate for home heating oil for people who are low income? Because theoretically, Guilbeault, shouldn't they be getting even more money back?
Well, and this is the whole thing, right? This is where their argument completely falls apart, because they're saying that, well, if Pierre cancels the carbon tax when he comes into government, he's taking money out of the pockets of Canadians. Well, technically, Guilbeault, aren't you doing the same thing?
No. You misunderstand that. Somehow two negatives and a positive. I don't even know. It's liberal math.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
I can't even come up with a ridiculous analogy because it absolutely makes no sense.
So he's saying, in order to be able to afford to switch over to a better fuel source, we need to take money away from them so they can afford to switch over to a better fuel source. That's using the liberal logic, because when you take the carbon tax away, even a little bit, you're taking money out of their pockets and they would be better off. That's the argument. So
yeah, it makes no sense.
So this is the problem when these liberals are literally dying on this hill. As we said before, when you just choose not to accept any facts and not to accept rational thought and arguments, you retreat into absurdity to the point where they're actually contradicting themselves openly. And it doesn't make any sense, and everybody knows it.
And I do take your point, Minister, that as far as volume goes, there are more of those homes outside of Atlantic Canada. But as a portion of the types of heating that's used, it's far greater in Atlantic Canada than it is in other parts of the country. And the Atlantic MP surrounding the Prime Minister, when he made that announcement, I think speaks to that fact. But at this point in time, given the affordability struggles, like you highlight, many of those using home heating oil are facing, would it not be worth considering pressing pause in this instance?
No, it wouldn't, because we can't put a pause on climate change. And what Pierre Poilievre never talks about is the fact that people right now, 8 out of 10 Canadians, families, get more money back than they pay in carbon pricing. So the richest among us don't, the people who pollute the most, but 8 out of 10 Canadian families, and that has been confirmed by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. So if we were to do that, we would actually hurt people economically while they're struggling. It wouldn't help them at all.
So let's just unpack that statement for a moment, because when the Parliamentary Budget Officer considered the in and out, exactly what you're referring to, he did determine that when you take just the direct input of the carbon tax and the value of the rebate, more Canadians are better off. But when you add on the economic impact, so for example, the impact on investment income and overall on economic growth, slightly more Canadians, he determined, were worse off. Add to that, Minister, the fact that you have about $2.5 billion, only $100 million of which has been allocated that was supposed to be set aside for those who are disproportionately impacted by the carbon price, so farmers, small business owners, and Indigenous people, and you have yet all these years in to disperse that money. Is it fair to truly say more Canadians are better off?
This is the face of a man who's confronted by logic and he doesn't know what to do. So a couple things there. Didn't he just say if we if we don't put the carbon tax increase, it's going to hurt Canadians economically?
How?
But you took the carbon tax off of home heating for Atlantic Canadians, and that was to help them economically.
Right, none of this makes sense. Like, absolutely none of it.
Like, I would say you can't make this stuff up, but the Liberals are on the spot. Like, they are literally making this up as they go along.
Again, Liberals make policy from a podium. They don't actually think things through.
And it's amazing to hear mainstream media talk about all of this stuff that has come out of the Parliamentary Budget Office. And here's another interesting thing. So one of the things that the federal government has been doing, and I think the fact that most Canadians feel the carbon tax directly, that's what they're focusing on. But here's the interesting thing. The government has actually been collecting carbon taxes from small businesses as well.
For a while now, for several years.
And there's a little problem with that system. They actually haven't been giving it back to the small businesses. So they've collected about $22 billion in federal carbon tax revenues, but only 1% has actually been returned to the small businesses.
Less than 1%. That's only, quote unquote, only $200 million.
So they've only returned 0.17%. So where's your revenue neutral carbon tax increase, right? Where is it? And here's the other thing. Talk about economics, and remember how the Liberals always say that they jump up and down when Pierre says that the carbon tax contributes to inflation. Well, here's the thing. So right here, the CFIB data shows that over half, 52% of small firms oppose carbon pricing. If the price on carbon increases to $170 per ton in 2030, as planned, that's what the Liberal plan is right now, over half, 56% of them, of small businesses said they would have to, wait for it, increase their prices to offset costs. And being forced to raise prices for consumers is not an attractive or easy option for a small business to take.
Honestly, I don't see how it's not 100% of them. How can you absorb a cost like that as a business unless you're making bank, which most small businesses aren't?
Well, here's the other options that they have, Fox. Over 4 in 10, or 45%, said it will increase pressure on them to freeze or cut salaries and wages, while 40% said that they will have to reduce investment in their business. So this is what the carbon tax is doing, folks. It is legit increasing the cost of everything, because you have to do that in order to maintain your profit margins, or in a small business's case, maintain at least your operating costs. And now what these small businesses are saying, and there's tens of thousands of small businesses in Canada, you are now going to be hurting the people that actually work for these small businesses, because these small businesses are not going to be able to pay them an increased wage. They're going to actually have to decrease their wages, or maybe change full-time people to part-time in order to offset costs. This is what the carbon tax is doing. But the Liberals will have you believe that it's the greatest thing, it's the greatest program in the history of Canada to fight climate change.
Absolutely, it is. The parliamentary budget officer, he did some interviews this week, is the first one to recognize that this analysis is a partial analysis. It doesn't take into account the economic benefits of growing renewable and clean tech industry and the investments that we're doing in electrification of transportation, which will have very beneficial economic impacts to Canadians. It will come over time in the coming years. The parliamentary budget officer is the first one to recognize that his analysis doesn't take into consideration the cost to Canadians of climate change. And in terms of farmers, we've returned more than $1 billion of federal investment to help farmers reduce their carbon footprint, to reduce their pollution in the last 2 years. There is a portion of the money that we still have to return for small and medium-sized businesses and to Indigenous communities, and we're working to do that, and this will happen in the coming months.
But with respect, Minister, that money has been set aside since 2019. Those small businesses are telling your government and us frequently how difficult things are for them at the moment. It's not nothing. It's 10% of what you've taken in through the carbon tax, and so far you've dispersed just $100 million of that.
Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? So they're supposed to be returning about $2 billion, and they've only returned about $100 million of that. What are you doing with that money, guys? Is it, no doubt what they're doing with it is they're using it to funnel these other failing programs.
Oh, probably. I wouldn't be surprised. It's not a revenue neutral program.
It's impossible.
Yeah. Just the whole concept is impossible, especially because we know the Taxpayers Federation has told us that it costs $200 million just to administrate the thing.
Right. So if you take $10 from somebody, you cannot then use the same $10 and give $12 back.
Right, it's impossible.
So a couple of things. I mean, we lowered taxes for small and medium-sized businesses. So we have been there for them. We supported them through the pandemic, through billions of dollars of federal support. 80% of the money that was spent during the pandemic to help Canadians, to help businesses, and especially small and medium-sized businesses, came from the federal government. In terms of the carbon pricing, we are in the process of returning that money. We haven't been sitting on $2 billion since 2019. The program was put in place in 2019. This money has accumulated over time, and we will be returning it to them as we promised to do, as I said, in the coming months.
Great argument. Well, we reduced taxes for small businesses, and we were there. We gave billions of dollars of the federal government through the pandemic. Yeah, and then you ripped it all back. Like, you gave them a deadline which they couldn't meet, and then you ripped it all back. Then you forced them to go and get finance loans that they're now paying interest on in order to actually pay back all of these SEBA payments.
The Liberal government doesn't support small business at all. Not only have they taken this money in the form of the carbon tax and not given it back as promised, as Cypher said, they also screwed them over with the SEBA loans. They just do not care.
No. Absolutely not whatsoever. And he doesn't even address, we didn't just have $2 billion in 2019. It's accumulated. Oh, so that makes it better.
Yeah, somehow that makes it better. In Guilbeault land, that makes it better.
And then I just wanted to look ahead, if you could, for a moment, Minister, to what the future looks like, because you know that this will form a big part of the political debate going forward and heading into the next election. Right now, the plan that your government laid out post-2019, the 2019 election, got us to 2030 and the targets that you set out to 2030, and that is when the price on carbon will reach $170 a ton. Do you intend for that price to continue to go up, since you do see this as such an integral part of your climate policy beyond 2030 to help Canada reach its 2050 target?
This is a really good question by Vassy, and the reason it's a good question is because they haven't met a single target outside of the pandemic year.
When everybody was locked inside their houses.
Right.
That year.
So it it begs the question, okay, so if this $170 per ton in 2030, and that all Canadians will be in the poorhouse as a result of that, not just the middle class and down, all Canadians will be. It begs the question, are you going to increase that when you don't meet your targets as an excuse? Because they would have to offset this massive deficit that they're going to be having, because as a result of putting more Canadians in the poorhouse, more Canadians are going to need all of this extra money in order to actually, survive. But this is the whole plan, right? Is to make the average Canadian citizen completely and utterly dependent on a Liberal government, so that you can never vote them out. But that's not going to happen.
So we haven't made a decision on that. We've started consultation to prepare the next phase of emission reduction, so post-2030 in Canada, in fact, going to 2035. Those consultations are ongoing. Canada will need to make a determination by next year, as per our United Nations commitment, to set those new targets for 2035. We will need to do that by next year, by 2025. There's no decision that has been made yet, other than we will continue increasing the price on pollution. But also, for people who are watching it, we will continue increasing the rebate so that 8 of 10 Canadians can continue receiving more than what they pay. But no decision has been made as to what would happen after 2030.
So Vassy, literally a few moments before, says, no, the parliamentary budget officer came back and said that more Canadians are actually getting less than they put into this plan. And he just says, well, people are going to be getting more money, and that's why 8 out of 10 Canadians. Like, dude, this is what the average voter needs to see. They are straight up lying to your face over and over and over again, and they're just ignoring the facts that are presented, hoping that you'll just forget about them.
It's total gaslighting.
It's complete gaslighting.
Like, I've heard of that in bad relationships, but never by a government.
Yeah, and they repeat it ad nauseum over and over and over again. And the thing is like, Pierre's talking points don't come from some conservative, far right leaning agenda. They come from the Liberal Parliamentary Budget Office. That's where he's getting his points from. It's their own government that is releasing this information, and they're just trying to hope, well, the average Canadian isn't going to look at this. Well, they are, Guilbeault.
You have a lot of experience in this field, and I'm wondering, from where you sit at this point, if you think, given the arguments your government has put forth, that the consumer side of the price on carbon, which the Climate Institute this week said was accounting for 8 to 9% of reductions in emissions by 2030, or projected to by 2030, if you believe it to be a key ingredient beyond 2030.
As you pointed out, Vassy, I've been doing this for some time. I've been looking at climate change measures, policies, programs for the better part of my adult life, really, the last 30 years. And if there's a measure somewhere that someone can point to me that will help us to achieve at least 10%, if we're talking about the fuel charge, of our 2030 targets at no extra cost to consumers. It's revenue neutral. Whatever we collect, we send back. If there's a measure like that lying around under a rock somewhere, someone needs to show it to me, because I haven't seen it.
Is that certainly the case, though, especially when you take into account what the Climate Institute pointed out this week, that the industrial side of the carbon price is 3 times as effective? Could you not strengthen measures on that side? And just to sort of add to that, I know that you're talking about Pierre Poilievre, but he isn't the only, and I understand your criticisms there, but he isn't the only politician saying a consumer price on carbon isn't necessary. Many of your progressive allies, like Premier Wab Kinew, like the leader of the Alberta NDP, Rachel Notley, like Liberal Bonnie Crombie, like Liberal Andrew Furey, all of them are saying the same thing as Pierre Poilievre in this instance.
How about that? Sometimes logic transcends party.
When your enemy agrees with you on something, you know it's true.
Well, in this case, for Guilbeault, when people who you would consider to be your equals are agreeing with your enemy, then it's probably true.
Right. So, and why is it true? Because Pierre is pulling it from the Parliamentary Budget Office. And this is what gives it legitimacy. And also, again, why would all of these Canadians in these 7 provinces, why would they all be up in arms? And these people are emailing their premier and their MPPs probably daily, if not weekly. That's why their premiers have actually stood up and said, okay, we're hearing you. We're going to stand up and ask for this from the federal government. That's what's happened, folks. There is no chance in hell that you have all of these 7 premiers from all different parties standing up just because they believe it's the right thing to do. No. They're standing up because their constituents are literally screaming at them, saying, we cannot afford any more. So for Guilbeault to stand there, as smug as he looks, and say, well, this is revenue neutral. Sorry. It's a flat-out lie. And you keep telling you that. The funny thing is Guilbeault is such a fanatic about this, I think he actually does believe it. But I think he's the only one in the Liberal government that believes it.
I don't know. I think Trudeau probably believes it. Freeland may or may not believe it. But the point being, all those backbenchers, they're hearing it from their constituents too. And they know that this is not helping Canadians. It's not helping the environment either.
Well, and, hats off to all of the Atlantic Canadians, because you were loud enough that your premiers, they couldn't ignore it anymore. They had to stand up and actually take a stand and force the government to do something.
Fighting climate change is hard. And the easy thing to do would be to cave in and say, okay, we won't do that. But if we don't continue putting in place measures to fight climate change, then it means more Canadians being impacted by heat waves. How many tens of thousands of Canadians had to be evacuated across the country last year? Sometimes once, twice, 3 times because of the forest fires. Nova Scotia, worst forest fires in the history of the country, worst droughts in the history of the country, worst tropical storm in the history of the country. And those provincial politicians who say we shouldn't be doing that haven't come up with any measures to say how we will fight climate change. They have no plan that shows how we get to meet our 2030 targets and contribute to the international efforts. Of course, Canada won't solve climate change on its own, but no one can do.
So Premier Fury has no plan. That's your contention, because he would contend otherwise.
Uh-oh.
Get him, Vassy.
Uh-oh.
Get him.
The look on her face when he tried to say that none of the premiers had any plan, and she just like, you may want to check your facts there, Guilbeault, because that is completely incorrect.
Well, and I love how the Liberals' go-to line is always, the Conservatives don't have a plan for climate change. Dude, they're the official opposition. They don't need a plan for climate change right now. And do you think that they're going to give away their entire platform ahead of an election? No, you guys want to know what they're going to do about climate change? How about you call an election? And I bet they'll tell you.
He doesn't have a plan that shows how we get to 2030. And if someone comes to tell me you shouldn't be doing this measure, then they have the responsibility to tell me and Canadians how we get there. Because otherwise it's just caving into political pressure. And yes, it's tough politically. But it's not because it's tough that we shouldn't be doing it. In fact, quite the opposite. We have a moral responsibility to Canadians, to our kids and grandkids, to ensure that we do everything we can to fight climate change and doing it at a cost that is reasonable. And pricing is one of the most efficient way of doing that. Doing it otherwise would mean more taxpayers' dollars on the hook for that.
I would love to see his justification for that. I really, really would. Because if your plan is just tax people and then give it back, well, that makes no sense. And what Vassy said earlier, and she's absolutely right, is that, well, the carbon price on industry seems to be far more effective. And, the Liberals keep pointing to the Conservatives running on a price on pollution. That's what they were talking about. They weren't talking about taxing Canadians. They were talking about putting a price on industry. Now, will people argue, well, that would potentially, be passed down to the consumer? Maybe, yeah. But it's better than taxing industry and Canadians. So, if you're going to do that, fine. Now, I don't think taxing industry is the way to go. I think, as Pierre has outlined, you don't take money away from Canadians. What you do is you incentivize the long-term and sustainable power generation projects. That's what you do, because you make it easy for that to come to market. And the easier that you make for that to come to market, the quicker then it can come in to replace the existing fuel sources. And then you take all of the natural gas and you ship that over to countries that are using coal so that they can convert to natural gas, thereby increasing Canadian prosperity. And then you take, as a government, take some of those profits. And then you take that and pay down the frickin' deficit. Like, there's ways to do this that is A, economically beneficial for literally everybody in the country, B, respectful of the environment, and C, you're being fiscally responsible by paying down this debt that the Liberals have skyrocketed.
And Guilbeault, if you think it's politically difficult now to force a carbon tax, just wait what happens and see how politically difficult things get for you and the Liberals if you keep trying to impoverish Canadians in this manner.
Yeah, he's going to find it how difficult it is on election day when he doesn't have a seat at the table anymore.
Fighting climate change is hard.